The year is 1187. The world trembles beneath the shadow of a name whispered from minaret to cathedral: Saladin. From the sun-scorched plains of the Levant to the cold cloisters of Christendom, word spreads like wildfire. Jerusalem, the holiest city of all, has fallen. And in that single world-shattering moment, the embers of an old fury ignite once again. Jerusalem had always been more than a city. It was an idea, a beacon for the faithful, a prize for kings, and a promise carved into stone. When the First Crusade seized it in 1099, Europe erupted in triumph. Pilgrims walked barefoot across the continent to kneel before the Holy Sepulchre. Chroniclers wrote that the streets ran red with the blood of Saracen defenders, a divine cleansing, they said, though history remembers it differently. For nearly a century, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood as a fragile outpost of the West, a Latin Christian bastion surrounded by the Islamic world. But beneath the banners and hymns, it was always a precarious dream, a dream sustained by men who fought for God, gold or glory, and sometimes all three. By the late 12th century, that dream was cracking. The Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, had grown weak, divided and complacent. Their knights quarrelled more with each other than with their enemies, and while they bickered, a new power was rising in the east. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the man known simply as Saladin. Born in Tikrit, raised in Damascus, he was not the product of royal blood, but of discipline, faith and intellect. To his followers he was a man of justice and humility. To his enemies, a formidable adversary cloaked in chivalric grace. He united Muslim lands torn apart by centuries of rival dynasties. Under his rule, Egypt and Syria became one, a single blade drawn against the Crusader world. When he rode, his horse glittered with green silk and gold thread, yet his tent was plain. He prayed 5 times a day, gave alms to the poor, and showed mercy to prisoners. But his sword arm was relentless. He saw the Crusaders not as mere foes of Islam, but as intruders, foreign conquerors, desecrating the sacred soil of Al-Quds, the noble sanctuary. And when provoked, he struck. The provocation came from a man who seemed born to cause disaster, Reynald of Chatillon, a name spat like venom across the Levant. He was everything Saladin despised: cruel, greedy, irreverent. The red-bearded lord of Kerak had grown rich by raiding caravans and ambushing pilgrims. In 1186, ignoring truces and reason alike, he attacked a Muslim caravan bound for Mecca, seizing its goods and killing its guards. To Saladin, that was not a raid. It was sacrilege. He swore an oath: "I will kill Reynald with my own hands." A year later, he kept that promise, but not before bringing the Crusader kingdom to its knees. It began on the dusty plains, north of Tiberias, in the shadow of 2 ancient volcanic hills, known as the Horns of Hattin. The summer of 1187 was merciless. The air shimmered with heat, and the grass had long since burned to straw. Saladin's army, perhaps 30,000 strong, encircled the Christian host under King Guy of Lusignan. The Crusaders, weighed down by heavy mail and iron helmets, staggered beneath the sun, their throats parched and their water supplies cut off. Archers loosed volleys of arrows tipped with fire. Smoke choked the air. The Crusaders' horses, maddened by thirst, reared and broke formation. By nightfall, the proud army of Jerusalem had become a desperate mob. The true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, carried into battle by priests, was captured. The knights of the temple and hospital were slaughtered or taken. King Guy of Lusignan and Reynald of Châtillon were found, captured, and brought before Saladin. Accounts differ, but most agree on what came next. Saladin offered King Guy a bowl of cool water, a token of mercy. Guy drank deeply. "You gave him drink," Reynald said, voice low. "You must spare him now." Saladin nodded. "Yes, I gave him water, so he is under my protection, but I did not give it to you." Moments later he drew his curved scimitar and struck Reynald down. The head of the man who had mocked Islam rolled across the carpeted floor of the Sultan's tent. King Guy watched silently. Jerusalem's doom was sealed. On the 2nd of October, 1187, the city surrendered. Unlike the massacre of 1099, there was no bloodbath. Saladin allowed most of the inhabitants to ransom their freedom. The bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre fell silent as the crescent rose above the dome of the rock. The news reached Europe in winter, carried by stunned survivors and trembling priests. When Pope Urban III heard, he reportedly died of shock. His successor, Gregory VIII, wasted no time. A new crusade was proclaimed. Not a rabble this time, not a band of zealots and opportunists. This would be a crusade of kings. Europe erupted in a storm of banners and oaths. The greatest monarchs of the age answered the call. From France came Philip II, calculating, pious, yet cold as marble. From the Holy Roman Empire came Frederick Barbarossa, the Iron Emperor, veteran of decades of warfare, his beard as red as flame, and his pride unbreakable. And from England, Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, soon to be king. Richard the Lionheart. He was not yet crowned when the call reached him, but destiny was already tugging at his sleeve. Fierce, cultured, impulsive, Richard was the embodiment of the knightly ideal, a poet and warrior both. He could compose verses in the evening and lead a charge at dawn. When his father, Henry II, died in 1189, Richard inherited not just a kingdom, but a mission. He would reclaim Jerusalem, whatever it took. That summer, the world seemed to turn on its axis. Across Europe, hammers rang from dawn till dusk as blacksmiths forged swords, spearheads, and mail links. Monks preached in marketplaces, stirring the crowds with promises of redemption and glory. Peasants sold land to buy passage to the Holy Land. Merchants stocked ships with grain, salted meat, wine, and water. Port cities like Marseille, Genoa, and Venice thrummed with activity, an armada in the making. Each crusader sewed a red cross upon his cloak. Each believed that taking up arms in God's name would wash away sin. But behind the holy rhetoric lay more complex motives. Kings saw opportunity to expand influence, to secure trade routes, to prove divine favour in the eyes of rivals. For some knights the crusade was penance, for others it was adventure, for all it was a gamble. Frederick Barbarossa was first to march. The spring sun beat down upon the dusty roads of Anatolia as the banners of the Holy Roman Empire cut their way east. Frederick Barbarossa, the Iron Emperor, 70 years old but still broad-shouldered and unbowed, rode at the head of a host that stretched for miles. Tens of thousands followed, armoured knights from Swabia and Saxony, footmen from Bohemia, crossbowmen from Lombardy, priests bearing relics and banners stitched with the cross. Their shields flashed red and white beneath a cloudless sky. The empire had come to the edge of the world, to the crumbling dominion of the Seljuk Turks, whose capital at Iconium stood astride the road to the Levant. To reach the Holy Land, Barbarossa had to pass through their territory. The Seljuks knew it, and they meant to bleed him for every mile. From the hills and ravines came the first harassing fire. Arrows hissed from unseen bowmen, striking down pack horses and wagon drivers. The Germans closed ranks, shields overlapping like scales, advancing grimly through the ambushes. It was a slow, brutal crawl. Water was scarce. The streams were fouled or blocked. Men collapsed from heatstroke, their armour too hot to touch. The Turks seemed to melt into the landscape, here one moment, gone the next, like smoke on the wind. By the time Barbarossa reached the plains before Iconium, he had lost hundreds to thirst and exhaustion. Yet the old emperor would not turn back. He ordered the banners raised and his horns to sound across the plateau. Ahead, on a low ridge, the Seljuk army appeared, horsemen in scale armour, their banners green and gold, their curved swords glinting like fishhooks in the sun. Drums thundered, trumpets wailed. The air trembled with the noise of it. The Germans formed their battle line. Heavy cavalry on the flanks, crossbowmen and spearmen in the centre, the imperial standard of the double-headed eagle rippling above. Barbarossa removed his helmet to pray, his long red beard streaked with dust. Then, without ceremony, he gave the signal. The charge began like the drawing of a bow, slow, measured, then violently unleashed. The German knights spurred their destriers, lances couched, and the ground itself seemed to quake. The Seljuk horse archers loosed volley after volley, arrows raining down like sleet. But the Germans did not break. Shields raised, eyes fixed on the ridge. They drove home their charge. The impact was devastating. The Turkish front ranks buckled beneath the weight of iron and horseflesh. The Crusaders smashed through the centre, swords and maces rising and falling in a blur. The clang of steel, the screams of men and beasts, the hot stink of sweat and blood. It was chaos given form. Barbarossa's son, Frederick of Swabia, led a detachment straight for the city gates. Iconium's defenders, unprepared for such fury, faltered. The Crusaders burst through, sweeping down narrow streets where the air was thick with incense and smoke. Arrows flew from rooftops. Doors slammed shut. The emperor himself rode through the gates soon after, his armour dented, his face streaked with grime, shouting for quarter to be given to those who laid down arms. By afternoon the city was theirs. The Seljuk army had scattered into the hills, leaving behind wagons of grain, casks of water, and enough food to feed the starving crusaders for weeks. The wells of Iconium, once poisoned, now ran clean. The German host drank deep, filling their cups and thanking God for deliverance. It was a resounding victory, the greatest the Crusaders had won since setting out. News of it spread like wildfire through Europe. Chroniclers hailed it as divine proof that even in old age, Barbarossa was God's chosen champion. Yet for those who had marched beneath that Anatolian sun, the triumph was tinged with exhaustion. They had crossed a continent, fought through ambush after ambush, only to find themselves far from home, and still hundreds of miles from Jerusalem. The city's narrow streets were lined with dead, and the wells ran pink from the washing of wounds. Even in victory, the smell of decay lingered. The emperor ordered the army to rest 3 days before resuming the march south towards Cilicia and the coast. But fate, as ever, was waiting. Within weeks, at a quiet river crossing near Silifka, Barbarossa would fall from his horse and drown, his armour dragging him down into the cold water. The great lion of the empire, undefeated in battle, was claimed not by sword or spear, but by the indifferent current of a foreign stream. The victory at Iconium, glorious though it was, became the final blaze of his legend, the last triumph of his old crusading spirit. The news spread like a shockwave. The emperor was dead. Leaderless and demoralised, much of his army turned back. Only a few thousand made it to Acre, ghostly remnants of the mightiest army ever raised for Christendom. The road to Jerusalem was now left to the two remaining kings, Philip of France and Richard of England. But these two were not friends. Philip was methodical, cautious, a master of statecraft. Richard was bold, reckless, consumed by the idea of personal glory. They shared a crusade, but not a cause. Even before they set sail, tension hung between them like the smell of steel before rain. Both men departed in 1190. Philip from Genoa, Richard from Marseille. Though Richard's fleet soon encountered a storm that scattered ships across the Mediterranean. Some wrecked on the coast of Cyprus, where survivors were seized by the island's ruler, Isaac Komnenos. It was a mistake Isaac would regret bitterly. Richard's temper was legendary, and when word reached him that his men were being held, he turned his fleet towards Cyprus with a vengeance. The invasion was swift and merciless. Cyprus, lush and wealthy, had long been a Byzantine outpost turned rogue. Its ruler fancied himself untouchable. Richard proved otherwise. His ships beached under a blazing sun, and armoured knights splashed ashore through the surf. Their mail hauberks shimmered silver. Bows twanged, swords flashed. Richard led from the front, his cruciform arming sword, a broad, one-handed blade forged by a master smith in Normandy, cutting through defenders like reeds. The weapon was not ornate, but perfectly balanced, its edge honed to a whisper. With his kite shield raised and his banner flying behind him, he carved a path inland, his knights thundering at his side. Isaac fled inland only to be captured days later. Richard had him bound in silver chains, as promised, not out of mercy, but mockery. Cyprus fell, and with it, Richard gained a vital staging ground for the crusade, a place to resupply, to regroup, and to prepare for the war ahead. After taking Cyprus in July 1191, Richard left behind a permanent naval base under his own men and the Knights Templars, and this foresight would serve him well in the months to come. He also gained a bride. Berengaria of Navarre, the daughter of a Basque king, arrived on the island en route to meet him. They were married in the chapel of Limassol, a brief moment of joy before the long shadow of war returned. From Cyprus, Richard turned his gaze eastward, toward Acre, the key to the Holy Land. Acre had become a crucible. For nearly 2 years the siege of Acre had dragged on, a festering wound on the coast of the Holy Land. The siege represented one of the strangest situations in medieval warfare. A siege within a siege, essentially 2 sieges at once. Inside Acre were Saladin's Muslim garrison, well fortified, well supplied at first, commanded by experienced emirs. Outside the walls of Acre were the Crusaders, a mixture of knights, Templars, Hospitallers, and soldiers from across Europe, fighting under the banners of Guy of Lusignan, the King of Jerusalem, and Conrad of Montferrat, the rival claimant to the throne. Guy was desperate to prove his legitimacy and reclaim his crown. After Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin, at this point he was a king without a kingdom. And surrounding them, in the hills and plains beyond, was Saladin's relief army, encircling the Crusaders to prevent reinforcements or escape. The Crusader camp sprawled along the shoreline, a city of mud and misery hemmed in between the sea and Saladin's encircling army. Canvas tents sagged under the weight of salt and dust. The summer heat turned the air thick and metallic, reeking of blood, pitch, and decay. The ground was so churned with filth that horses sank to their fetlocks in black mud. The cries of the wounded mixed with the drone of flies that never stopped. Dead men and animals were buried shallowly, or not at all. When the wind changed, It carried the stench of rot straight through the camp. The hospitals of the Templars and Hospitallers overflowed, crude pavilions lined with pallets of straw, where monks worked barehanded in the heat, cutting away gangrenous flesh, pouring wine into open wounds, and whispering last rites over men too weak to rise. Water came from barrels filled at the shore, foul, warm, often tinted brown. Bread was hard as iron. Fever and dysentery spread like fire through the ranks, felling knights and peasants alike. Some raved in delirium, seeing visions of saints above the city walls. Others simply slipped away in silence, faces sunken, lips cracked. By day, Saladin's forces loomed on the hills beyond, a dark mirage of banners and cavalry, always watching, always closing the noose. Every few nights they would strike, a rain of arrows or a sudden cavalry raid, forcing the exhausted crusaders to their feet once more. They fought by torchlight, blades flashing through smoke, the clash of steel echoing across the plain before fading back into the darkness. Inside the city walls, the garrison suffered too. Saladin smuggled in supplies where he could, but starvation stalked both sides. The defenders melted down pots and armour for arrowheads. The Crusaders built ever larger siege towers and mangonels, dragging timber from the coast to feed the machines. When the engines fired, the earth shook, vast stones crashing into Acre's battlements, sending dust plumes rising like storm clouds. At times the smoke from burning pitch blotted out the sun, turning day into a choking twilight. Yet even amid the horror, life persisted. Traders slipped between the camps, selling dates, wine, and dice. Priests held mass beside the corpses of their flock. Drunken brawls broke out between men who had long forgotten why they were there. Others fell to their knees and prayed for deliverance, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for ships that might never come. Discipline held only by fear and faith. The Templars flogged deserters. The Hospitallers enforced silence with cold efficiency. But beneath the banners and hymns, the Crusader army was a powder keg of hunger, disease, and despair. A dying host, trapped between the walls of Acre and the scimitars of Saladin, clinging to the hope that reinforcements might yet save them. When Richard's sails appeared on the horizon in June 1191, hope surged. Trumpets blared, banners waved, and men wept openly. Richard wasted no time. Within days he established command and unleashed a relentless and renewed assault upon Acre. Siege engines creaked and thundered, great mangonels hurling stones the size of barrels, crossbowmen, their cords greased with wax, fired bolts that clattered against the city's walls. At night, the sky glowed orange from burning pitch. Richard's engineers constructed massive trebuchets, Bad Neighbour and Evil Neighbour they called them, and each day they smashed Acre's towers to rubble. Inside, the defenders suffered terribly. Saladin sent relief forces, but even his genius could not break the Crusader line. His men charged under a hail of arrows, only to be repelled again and again. By July, Acre was starving. Its garrison, once fierce, begged for mercy. They surrendered on the 12th of July, 1191. After nearly 2 years, the city had fallen, but peace was not to follow. Tens of thousands of prisoners, Muslim soldiers and civilians alike, were taken captive. Negotiations for ransom dragged on. Saladin delayed, hoping to buy time. Richard, ever impatient, saw it as defiance. On a hot August morning, he gave the order. More than 2,000 prisoners were marched beyond Acre's walls and executed, cut down by sword and spear, their bodies left for the vultures. Chroniclers wrote that Richard wept afterwards, but few believed it. War in that moment had become vengeance. Saladin was enraged. His army struck back along the coast, and the Third Crusade began in earnest. The heat shimmered across the coastal plain of the Levant, where the Mediterranean murmured softly against the sand. In the distance, banners rippled in the sea breeze, crimson crosses and white crescents shimmering like ghosts in the haze. The truce between Saladin and Richard had shattered. The massacre at Acre had poisoned any hope of negotiation. Each side now marched with grim determination, knowing that every skirmish, every heartbeat, would decide the fate of Jerusalem. Richard's army moved south along the coast. 30,000 men, a living tide of steel and dust. They trudged mile after mile through sweltering heat, always within sight of the sea. Supply ships shadowed them offshore, carrying water, grain, and wine. It was a masterstroke of logistics. By hugging the coast, Richard ensured that his men could be resupplied daily from vessels operating out of his new naval base in Cyprus, along with Tyre and Acre, now under Crusader control. This coastal resupply strategy was what kept Richard's army alive. His control of the sea became a lifeline that Saladin could not sever, and a logistical superiority that Saladin could never match. His formation was a thing of precision. Infantry formed the core. Heavily armed footmen from England, Normandy and Poitou, their mail hauberks glinting under the sun. To the rear, and on the flanks, rode the knights of the temple and hospital, mounted on war horses bred for power and endurance. Between them, in orderly ranks, marched spearmen, crossbowmen and camp followers, cooks, blacksmiths, surgeons and priests. They moved like a single organism, disciplined and deadly, and hovering just beyond the horizon, like wolves circling a herd, rode Saladin's cavalry. The Muslim horsemen were the finest in the world, swift, elusive, and unnervingly silent. They harried the column by day, firing arrows from recurved horsebows of horn and sinew. Each shot was a whisper of death, loosed from horseback with terrifying accuracy. The Crusaders' shields bristled with black-feathered shafts. The air smelled of sweat, horsehide, and fear. Yet Richard's men held their ranks. They did not break formation to chase the enemy, no matter how fierce the taunts or how close the arrows came. The king himself rode the line, shouting encouragement, his great helm gleaming like a sunburst. He knew discipline was everything. One reckless charge could unravel them all. For 2 weeks the armies stalked one another down the coast, from Acre to Haifa, from Haifa to Arsuf. Each night, Richard ordered his men to camp in tight circles, the wagons forming makeshift walls. Fires burned low, arrows were gathered, wounds bound in the flickering light. Men prayed quietly, their lips moving over words that trembled in the hot night air. They knew Saladin was near, and they knew he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on the morning of September the 7th, 1191. The Crusaders were just north of Arsuf, a small coastal town surrounded by scrub and dunes. The sun had barely risen when the first waves of Saladin's army appeared, emerging from the dust like a mirage. The Sultan had brought his full strength, tens of thousands of mounted warriors, each armed with horsebow and curved sabre, their banners snapping green and white. A low hum spread through the Crusader ranks. They tightened formation. Shields locked, spears lowered. The attack began with arrows, a black storm that fell upon them like rain. The noise was deafening, the hiss of bowstrings, the rattle of arrows on metal, the screams of wounded men and horses. The Crusaders held firm. The knights of the temple rode rearguard, protecting the slower infantry. The Hospitallers held the flank. Saladin's horsemen darted in and out, striking, retreating, reforming. Their horses kicked up plumes of dust, that turned the air opaque. The Crusaders could see little beyond the silhouettes of riders and the flash of steel. Richard, ever the commander, waited. His instinct screamed for counterattack, but he held back. He knew Saladin was trying to provoke him, to break his perfect marching order. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning armour into ovens. Men collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Still, Richard gave no order to charge. He rode the line, his face hidden by his helm, his voice raw from shouting, "Hold! Hold your line!" But tension was building like pressure in a sealed vessel. The Hospitallers, under relentless attack on the rear, could bear it no longer. Without orders, they spurred forward, lances levelled, roaring their battle cry, "Deus vult, God wills it!" The dam burst. The Crusader line surged forward, an unstoppable wave of knights crashing into Saladin's vanguard. The impact was catastrophic. The weight of mail and horseflesh smashing through the lighter cavalry like a hammer through glass. Saladin's men scattered under the sheer force of it. Arrows and scimitars were no match for the momentum of armoured knights at full gallop. Spears shattered, men screamed, sand turned red. Richard, realising what was happening, did not chastise his impetuous Hospitallers. He seized the moment. He ordered the full countercharge. The battlefield erupted. The sound was a living thing. Thunder of hooves, clash of steel, cries of men locked in mortal combat. Richard rode at the heart of the storm, his sword a blur of silver. Chroniclers would later say he struck down men as if guided by divine fury. His horse, covered in blood and dust, plunged into the melee, trampling archers and scattering lancers. For a moment the world was chaos, but in that chaos Richard's timing was perfect. His knights broke through Saladin's front line, then wheeled left and right, carving into the flanks. The infantry advanced behind, shouting hymns and curses in equal measure. Saladin tried to rally his men, galloping among them on a white stallion, but the momentum was lost. His army began to withdraw in good order. Not a rout, but a retreat born of necessity. The day was lost. Arsuf belonged to the Crusaders. When the dust settled, thousands lay dead or dying. The stench of blood and salt filled the air. Richard dismounted and removed his helm. His face was streaked with sweat and grime, his eyes hard and distant. Victory, but at what cost? The Battle of Arsuf was more than a triumph. It was a statement. It showed that Saladin's cavalry, so feared, so fluid, could be beaten by discipline, timing, and iron resolve. The name Richard Coeur de Lion began to echo even in Muslim lands, half in awe, half in dread. But Richard knew the road ahead was long. Jerusalem was still far inland, and every mile would bleed him of strength. Richard pushed on toward Jaffa, the gateway to Jerusalem and the key to the coast. It was a battered, half-ruined port when he reached it, its walls smashed by years of war, its harbour choked with wrecks. Yet Richard saw what it could be. A lifeline to his fleet, a shield for the march inland. He set his men to work immediately. Engineers, carpenters, and masons from the army laboured side by side beneath the blazing sun. Stone by stone, they rebuilt the fortifications. The air rang with the clang of hammers and the scrape of chisels. Ships arrived daily from Acre and Cyprus, bringing food, timber, and fresh troops. Slowly the city took shape again, a Crusader fortress reborn from rubble. But Saladin watched. From the hills inland, his scouts saw the Crusader banners rising once more over Jaffa, and his generals urged him to strike. The Sultan bided his time, waiting for the right moment as the armies stared at one another across the shimmering plains. For almost a year, the uneasy stalemate held. Then, in the summer of 1192, as Richard withdrew north to consolidate his position, Saladin made his move. He struck like a thunderclap. 10,000 of his finest troops swept down from the hills and fell upon Jaffa at dawn. The garrison, barely a few hundred men, fought from street to street, but the walls were still weak, the gates still scarred. Saladin's men poured through the breaches, their war cries echoing over the crash of steel. Within hours, the city was theirs. Smoke rose over the harbour. The surviving crusaders retreated to the citadel by the sea, a squat, stone-walled keep that looked out across the surf. There they barricaded themselves, holding off wave after wave of assaults, while messengers fled north by boat to find their king. Richard was at Acre when the news reached him, exhausted, feverish, and still reeling from months of marching. He didn't hesitate, gathering what ships and men he could, scarcely 7 galleys and a few hundred knights. He set sail immediately, the wind roaring in the rigging. Chroniclers said his eyes blazed with fury. He would not let Saladin keep Jaffa. At dawn the next day, his fleet appeared off the coast. The city was still burning, the smoke hanging over the water like a shroud. Muslim banners fluttered from the ramparts. The defenders on the citadel roof saw the English sails cresting the horizon and began to shout and wave. Richard ordered the helmsmen to run the ships aground. The hulls struck the shallows with a thunderous crash. The king leapt overboard, sword in hand, the surf foaming around his knees, his mail glinting like molten silver in the morning sun. Behind him came his knights, splashing ashore in a frenzy, shields raised against the arrows hissing from the walls. The counter-attack was pure audacity, a few hundred men storming a city held by thousands. They fought up from the beach, step by bloody step, through the narrow streets where broken spears and fallen bodies littered the ground. Richard's sword rose and fell, cutting a path through the defenders. One eyewitness wrote that he fought as one inspired by God, alone worth 1,000. By midday, Saladin's troops were in retreat, falling back through the city gates. The Crusaders reached the citadel and tore open its doors. The garrison inside, half mad from thirst and smoke, stumbled out cheering, weeping, kissing the hem of Richard's cloak. Against every expectation, Jaffa was once again in Crusader hands. But Saladin was not finished. Within days he returned with his full army, 12,000 men, banners streaming in the sea breeze. Richard had fewer than 2,000 fit to fight. There would be no retreat, no reinforcements. He gathered his captains on the beach and drew his sword in the sand, marking the line where they would stand and die if need be. When the attack came, it was like the breaking of a storm. Arrows darkened the sky, the air filled with the beating of drums. Saladin's cavalry charged again and again, their scimitars flashing in the sunlight, hooves churning the sand to dust. The Crusaders stood shoulder to shoulder behind walls of shields, crossbowmen firing in perfect rhythm, bolts whistling into the oncoming waves of horsemen. Richard moved constantly along the line, shouting orders, rallying his men. When the Saracens broke through on the flank, he led the countercharge himself, spurring his horse straight into the melee, cutting down riders left and right until the enemy fell back. His standard bearer was struck down. Richard seized the banner himself and planted it in the sand. "Here we stand," he cried, his voice carrying over the clash of arms. 3 hours, the battle raged. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault faltered. Saladin's men were spent. They withdrew beyond bowshot, leaving the shore strewn with the dead. The Crusaders, blackened with smoke and dust, still held Jaffa. That fight on the beach, a handful of men holding off an army, became legend. Even Saladin, watching from the hills, is said to have marvelled at the king's courage. "What a man," he murmured. "If all the kings of the Franks were like him, they would take the world from us." For Richard it was his last great victory. The city was saved, but the price was exhaustion. Both armies were broken, both commanders, weary of endless war. Within weeks they would begin to talk of peace, but on that day, beneath the burning sun of Jaffa, the Lionheart's legend was sealed forever. Letters home told of endless sand, the distant shimmer of mirages, and the ache of endless marching. Armour corroded with salt and sweat. Men prayed for rain, yet despite all hardship, morale held firm. They believed they were nearing the threshold of destiny, the road to Jerusalem. Saladin, meanwhile, retreated into the hills of Judea to regroup. He was shaken but not broken. His respect for Richard grew, as did his resolve to outwit him. "Never," he is said to have told his generals, "have I seen a man like that among the Franks." Both men began to play a deadly game of strategy. Each knew that brute force alone would not decide the fate of the Holy City. Richard pushed inland to Ascalon, rebuilding its walls that Saladin had destroyed. His engineers worked tirelessly, stacking limestone blocks in the relentless heat, while the king himself supervised with sword at his hip, a commander who never stood idle. At night, the glow of 100 campfires lit the ruins like fallen stars. Yet time and disease took their toll. Dysentery, heat-stroke, and fever swept through the Crusader ranks. Even Richard fell ill, confined to a tent, shivering and sweating as priests prayed over him. Rumours spread that the Lionheart was dying. Saladin, hearing this, ordered an attack, only to be met with Richard himself, weak but defiant, carried into battle on a stretcher. His mere presence was enough to steady his men. The attack failed. Despite his victories, Richard faced a grim truth. Jerusalem was close, but unreachable. His army was exhausted, supply lines stretched thin. Scouts reported Saladin's forces entrenched around the city, the wells poisoned, the countryside stripped bare. To besiege Jerusalem without water would be suicide. In the winter of 1191 to 92, the Crusaders came within 12 miles of the Holy City. From the high ridges near Ramla, they could see the faint glimmer of its domes and walls. Chroniclers wrote that many fell to their knees, weeping. But Richard did not. He stared in silence, calculating. He knew what they all feared to admit, that even if they took the city, they could not hold it. The moment they withdrew, Saladin would take it back, and so, against the prayers of his men, he ordered the retreat. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Saladin, too, faced weariness. His empire was vast, his army strained by years of unending war. His lieutenants urged him to negotiate, and so, reluctantly, both leaders began to exchange envoys. What followed was one of the most extraordinary correspondences in medieval history. Two enemies, each deeply devout, addressing one another with respect rather than hatred. Richard admired Saladin's honour. Saladin admired Richard's courage. They sent gifts, horses, fruit, even a snow-cooled drink from Lebanon's mountains to ease the English king's fever. When Richard's horse was slain in battle, Saladin sent him 2 of his own. It was a strange kind of warfare, brutal in combat, yet almost courtly in spirit. The 2 men, bound by rivalry, seemed to understand each other in ways their followers could not. By August, both sides were exhausted beyond measure. Saladin's treasury was drained. Richard's men begged to go home. His brother John and King Philip plotted against him in Europe, threatening his crown. He could not stay. Negotiations resumed, this time in earnest. 4 weeks, envoys rode back and forth between the 2 camps, their letters sealed with wax and prayer. Neither side would yield Jerusalem, yet both longed for peace. At last, in September 1192, the Treaty of Ramla was signed. It declared that the coastal cities from Jaffa to Tyre would remain in Christian hands, while Jerusalem would stay under Muslim rule, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit freely, unarmed and unharmed. It was not triumph. It was not defeat. It was something in between. A fragile peace, born of exhaustion and mutual respect. When the treaty was sealed, Richard met with Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, for the final exchange of words. The two men clasped hands. "If God wills," Richard said, "we shall meet again, not as enemies, but as friends." Saladin smiled. "In God's time, all men are brothers." The war was over. Richard prepared to leave the Holy Land. He had not reclaimed Jerusalem, but he had saved the Crusader states from collapse, restored their dignity, and shown the world what leadership, courage, and restraint could achieve. The name Lionheart would echo through centuries to come, and as his ships sailed west, the wind carrying the scent of sand and myrrh, the sun dipped low over the Holy Land, a land forever changed, but never truly at peace. The sails of Richard's ships caught the wind, and the coastline of the Holy Land began to fade into a hazy line behind him. The waves whispered against the hull, as if murmuring farewells in languages older than faith itself. He had come so close, close enough to see the glint of Jerusalem's walls in the distance, to feel its pull like a heartbeat beneath the sand. But he had not taken it. The holy city remained in Muslim hands. Still, the Treaty of Ramla had given Christendom something it hadn't known in decades: breathing room, dignity, and a fragile peace. The ports were safe again. Pilgrims could travel without fear. And for now, at least, the bloodletting had stopped. As Richard's fleet turned west, storms brewed over the Mediterranean. The sea was treacherous in those months. Sudden squalls, shifting winds, the kind of weather that could scatter a fleet like leaves. Richard's ships were separated near the Dalmatian coast. His own vessel was damaged, forcing him to make landfall far north, in territory ruled by enemies of his house. Disguised as a pilgrim, the most famous man in Europe tried to slip home in secret. It was a dangerous gamble. He was recognized near Vienna, captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, a man Richard had insulted at Acre, tearing down his banner and calling him a coward. Now the Duke had his revenge. Leopold delivered his prisoner to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who saw opportunity where others might have seen risk. A king's ransom, quite literally. Richard the Lionheart, conqueror of Cyprus, victor of Arsuf, scourge of Saladin, was dragged in chains across the Alps, imprisoned in a cold German keep. The news hit England like a thunderclap. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, began a desperate campaign to raise the vast ransom demanded for his release. 150,000 marks, a sum so vast it threatened to bankrupt the kingdom. Taxes were levied, churches stripped of treasure, commoners gave coin and prayer alike. It took more than a year, but at last the silver was gathered, and in February 1194 the Lionheart was freed. When he finally set foot on English soil, Richard was no longer the radiant crusader who had left with fire in his eyes and the cross on his chest. He had seen too much: blood, sand, treachery, honour, and loss. Yet his legend had only grown. To his subjects, he was the embodiment of the chivalric age, bold, loyal, fierce in war and noble in mercy. To his enemies, he was the measure of a king. Even Saladin, when he heard of Richard's capture, is said to have offered prayers for his safety. But England itself had changed. His brother John, ambitious, cunning, had plotted to seize the throne. Philip of France had moved against his lands. The realm was fractious, and its coffers nearly empty. Richard spent the rest of his reign fighting to reclaim what he had lost, waging war in Normandy until an arrow struck him dead outside a minor fortress in 1199. His last words were reportedly simple: I die as I have lived by the sword. He was 41 years old, just 41. The Lionheart's heart, literally, was removed from his body and buried in Rouen, the ecclesiastical capital of Normandy, France. His body was taken to Fontevraud Abbey, near Chinon, in the Loire Valley. His effigy there shows him lying beside his father and mother, Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Richard the Lionheart's effigy at Fontevraud bears no sword, no crown, just a face carved in calm repose, as though at last he had found peace. And what of Saladin, the great unifier, the warrior of the Crescent? He lived only a few months beyond the truce. In March 1193 he fell ill in Damascus. When his physicians realized he would not recover, they wept openly. The man who had humbled the Crusaders and restored Jerusalem died with barely enough coin to pay for his burial shroud. He had given his wealth to the poor, to orphans, to widows, to the people he believed God had entrusted to him. His death sent a wave of sorrow through the Muslim world, but also through parts of Christendom. Chroniclers who once cursed his name now called him a prince of justice who lived by the law of mercy. Two great men, enemies in life, yet united by something rare in that age: respect. Their duel had been as much one of ideals as of arms. The peace they forged did not last. It never does. Barely a decade after Richard's death, the Fourth Crusade was launched, but it never reached Jerusalem. Instead, it turned upon Constantinople, sacking a Christian city in one of the most shameful episodes in medieval history. The 5th, the 6th, the 7th, all came and went, each less glorious, less pure than the legends they tried to emulate. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem limped on for another century, shrinking bit by bit until the fall of Acre in 1291. After that, the cross was gone from the Holy Land for good. And yet the Third Crusade endured in memory, not for its victory or its spoils, but for the strange humanity that flickered amid the carnage. The world had glimpsed something in Richard and Saladin that transcended faith and empire, a kind of mutual recognition, as if they saw in each other the same restless fire. Historians still debate the meaning of it all. Was the Third Crusade a failure? In a sense, yes. Jerusalem remained beyond reach. But in another sense, it was a turning point. It reshaped diplomacy between East and West, tempering centuries of hatred with a measure of understanding. Trade reopened, pilgrimages resumed, knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, medicine flowed once again between civilizations. The Crusade did not heal the world, but it forced it to see itself. It revealed how faith, ambition, and honour could drive men to greatness and ruin. It showed that even amid blood and fire, respect could exist between foes. That courage and cruelty could share the same soul. And perhaps that is why the story still endures, not as a tale of conquest, but as a mirror reflecting what we choose to worship and what we're willing to sacrifice for it. Somewhere in the echoing halls of Rouen Cathedral, under stone, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims, the effigy of the Lionheart still lies, guarding his very heart. His carved hands rest on his sword, his gaze fixed on the heavens. In Damascus, Saladin's tomb stands under green marble, the air rich with incense. Each year visitors still leave flowers at his door, Christians and Muslims alike. Two graves, two legacies, one story that binds them. The Crusader and the Sultan, men who fought like lions and spoke like brothers. Their rivalry shaped an era. Their respect outlived them both. And the dust of their battles still drifts across the ancient hills of the Holy Land, where the wind hums through olive trees, and the stones remember every step that ever bled upon them. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.